Hi, this is the Magnificent Midlife podcast, and I'm Rachel Lancaster. This is where we celebrate women in midlife and beyond. We challenge the status quo and bash those negative stereotypes about being an older woman. We're not over the hill at 40, 50, 60. We're just getting started, and the world needs us now more than ever. I'll be talking all things midlife, about issues that matter, and sharing fabulous stories of amazing women doing very cool stuff. Now is our time. Jo Pybus is a writer, feminist, and what she calls a late-onset athlete. She's an Ironman, although I want to say Ironwoman, and represented Australia in triathlon and cycling in her 40s. She's latterly become a champion for raising awareness of menopause. Her mantra is better late than never. So welcome, Jo.
Thank you, Rachel. It's so lovely to be here. So thank you for having me on.
Well, it's great to have you here, and it's lovely to meet you, and I'm really looking forward to digging into your story. So I'm going to kick off with asking, what inspires you?
Oh, that's a really, really complex and difficult question for the first one, Rachel. How dare you? What inspires me? I think what inspires me is the battlers of the world, people who do amazing things that don't necessarily talk about it a lot, and people who take on things that they otherwise wouldn't have expected that they would. And I think often when I was brought up, my uncle, who's now a man in his 70s, he was born with cerebral palsy. And I remember being a child, and my Uncle Bill was just amazing, but he was just my Uncle Bill. And he, back in the day, went to the spastic centre. And when I grew up, we knew that Uncle Bill was a spastic, and it wasn't, that was the terminology we used back then.
Yeah,
it sounds dreadful, of course,
too.
in today's terms. It wasn't until I saw the movie My Left Foot that I understood that my Uncle Bill had cerebral palsy. And just watching what he's done in his life, he worked for 40 years for what we call Telstra, which is, your British Telecom. And, he bought his own home, and still today he manages everything on his own. He used to get around on crutches, and just what he managed to do with all that difficulty is really what inspires me, I think.
But that has also, I'm sure, it has inspired what you're doing now, hasn't it?
Look, I guess it has. I guess I never think of things as being too hard or not worth trying, because people get along every day without the privileges and the resources that I have. So, yeah, I guess that's probably just a part of what drives me to take on things that maybe other people might think are just way out of the realms of possibility. And I think there's also the factor that I actually don't care whether I achieve. I have a very strong motivator, and it's not a fear of failure, but it's a fear of regret of what I might feel if I don't give it a go. So I actually heard the term in a podcast once. I have this regret intolerance. So whether I fail or get there, that's not the point. The fact is that I tried. So I think that's another part of me that changes it from being a fear to I don't want to live with the regret.
I think that's brilliant, actually, because we connected, didn't we, through Tanya Dalton, who referred me to you.
Yes.
And she talked about how when she was younger, she wouldn't have done stuff because she was nervous, because she didn't want to fail. But as she got older, and we talked a little, I mentioned this before we hit record, that idea of the gift of getting older, the gift of midlife, the gift of menopause, whatever you want to call it, that we don't care as much anymore. And Tanya talked about that now, she was ready to do the Ironman because if she failed, well, she wouldn't have failed anyway, because she'd have done it, she'd have tried it, and that in itself was success. And I can imagine for you, because you have a big background of athleticism, that failure must have You must have had that at some stage, I guess, but as you went through life or as you got a bit older, that went away, did it? How did that work?
Yeah, look, when I think about that late onset athlete that I now call myself, I really didn't start to embrace fitness in any meaningful way until my mid-30s because, look, I wasn't sporty as a child. I was the kid that had to make up the numbers at the school swimming carnival and nearly drown under a face full of my own floating hair. So,
Oh, good
and
grief.
so there was nothing happening in my childhood that would suggest that I would go on and do those things. And when I was married and had 3 kids, it was probably then I started to pay attention to needing exercise because I saw that my body had, gone through this big shift in the shape and strength and weight that I'd put on from having kids. And in all honesty, Rachel, I just wanted to fit back into my jeans. So exercise got my attention really for aesthetic reasons rather than health. And my husband, bless him at the time, gave me a book called Body for Life, which was in the early 2000s when everyone was doing these 12-week programs and you'd do the before and after photos. So I'd drag myself and the kids out the door a couple of days a week and go down to my local gym where they had a crèche, and I followed the program in that book. And by the time I got back into my jeans, I'd become this willing participant in exercise, and a friend encouraged me to try a novice triathlon, which I did, and I started to uncover this sort of competitive side. And this led to me at the ripe old age of 38 joining a triathlon club. And once I did that, I become part of a community, and there's that whole, team spirit, even though it's an individual sport. And you become involved with all these age group competitive athletes who race against each other all over the country. And then, of course, you might get chosen through your races to compete for Australia at the World Champs. So, yeah, there was a decade where I represented Australia 3 times. I completed 2 Ironman triathlons. And then my last and hardest endurance event was when I was 48 and I ran a 102-kilometre trail run. But this, Rachel, was where the wheels fell off, and on a number of fronts in my life. And I realised I had to back off taking on such huge physical feats. And that led me on to my next late onset pursuit that was writing. So even though when I look back at who I was before that and where I am now, yes, that was extraordinary, and I'm very proud of myself for doing it. The pivoting to then take on another challenge that in many ways is equally as hard has really, I guess, shown a side to my personality that I'm really pleased to have, because, I mean, you fight harder when you get older to be inspired to do new things. It's very easy to become an old person. And yes, age shouldn't be the defining factor of that. So, yeah, that's where that took me. And I'm a bit like Tanya when you spoke to her. I still can't believe I did those things. But very proud I did.
I can't believe you did those things. I'm just sort of like gobsmacked. I mean, 102-kilometre trek, excuse me, when you were running on this 102.
I know, and I love it that race was 102 kilometres. It was officially 102 kilometres. I'm thinking, yeah, no, 100 kilometres for me.
Yeah, well, let's add an extra 2. Why
2?
not? Yeah. But that's not even... What is it? There's a mega marathon rate of something 50 or something miles, isn't it? You've just doubled it, Like,
an ultra marathon, I think. And a marathon's 42.2. I think an ultra marathon is 50. And then, well, I did 2 ultras plus 2K.
But why? Why did you do that?
Well, it was an interesting event. It was here in Canberra. So I live in Canberra, the capital of Australia, and we're a relatively new city. And in 2013, Canberra turned 100 years old. And the Sri Chinmoy, who are a famous group around the world for doing endurance events, running triathlon. And when Canberra turned 100 in 2013, they decided they would put on a 100-kilometre trail run in the ACT, where I live. And this run was not only trails, but up over every hill and mountain around the whole sort of area that is the Australian Capital Territory. So anyway, it was, interesting. And then they decided that each year Canberra got older, 101, it would be 101, and then the next year it'd be 102. And I had a friend that had run 100 kilometres, and I just thought, I really want to give that a go, because I'd done Ironman. I was used to events that went all day, and I was used to training hard like that. So, you know, I'd built to that. I'd done a couple of Ironmen, but I just thought, I really want to do this one day. And I just think if I wait every year, that's just adding another kilometre on. So I just madly signed up to do it. I think
Before
there was
110.
Look, there were some other things at play there too, Rachel. Look, around that time, I'd lost my mum the year before, and there was a lot of grief involved there. So the training for this event was probably a part of me just pounding out that grief, you know, because I had to train really long hours. And yeah, it sort of, it helped, I think. And so I set my mind to it, and I was going to do it, but I suffered severely doing it. There was a lot going on with my body at that time that I really hadn't attributed to perimenopause, because I was clueless and didn't even know what perimenopause meant. So, you know, I put everything into finishing in that long trail run, but afterwards I just had to do this big audit, because my body behaved appallingly afterwards. And
no, your body didn't behave appallingly. Your body did exactly what it was supposed to do. It was you that went off and did 102 kilometres. Was it mile? 102 mile.
No, kilometres, not miles. No. But look, you know, you're quite right. And, you know, the problem is someone forgot to tell me what my body was doing. And, you know, after that event, I actually spent quite a bit of time trawling the internet, and it was then I learnt for the first time, to my horror, what perimenopause meant. And I'll give you an example of how clueless I was. When I was training for that event, one of my problems was my periods were very heavy, very frequent, and went for a long time. So that was draining me of iron. And so for the first time in my life, I had to go and buy these extra long overnight maxi pads and start using them. And the brand that I bought had printed trivia on the tearaway strip. So I learnt that turtles can breathe out their butts before I knew what perimenopause was. Now, sadly, that is a typical story I hear from a lot of women. So I had that confusion at that time of thinking, my body's not doing what I've been used to for the last 10 years. What the frick frack snickety snacks happening here? And then I had to go, well, you know, brakes on, what do I do next?
Yeah. But you got there, you worked it out. But
look, there was no way I was not going to finish that race. Once I got to the start line, and I think Tanya Dalton talked about that with Ironman, you know, one of the biggest achievements was just getting to the start line, because the training for these things is excruciating. And if you can get there without being injured and having some reason why you can't start, and so the event itself becomes like, oh, golly, thank God I'm doing this finally, because, you know, the trainings can be quite a painful process.
Well, hats off to you. I mean, I'm amazed. And having experienced perimenopause myself, and the way that we do have to adapt to what is going on with our bodies, are even more kudos to you for managing to do what you did. But I do suspect that your bad experience was probably exacerbated, or the whole experience that you had at that time of perimenopause was probably exacerbated by the pressure you were putting your body under. Because even by normal pressure standards, you had like gone to the moon and back again.
No doubt. Yeah, look there, and you know, as I said, there was an awful lot happening, you know, around mum passing and things like that. So it was a pressure cooker of a time, that is for sure. Yeah.
It's interesting because Jo Mosley, who's been on my podcast twice, she found solace for her own mother passing and grief by doing a huge challenge on her rowing machine, which then turned into a whole other life where she now does stand-up paddleboarding. But first of all, it was doing, I don't know what is this, 1,000-kilometer challenge or something on a rowing machine in her garage, and she would just row and row and row.
Yeah,
But that helped her. It's interesting that the physicality of doing that sort of thing is a way that can help us process grief, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. And you know, look, it was certainly mum dying that was a big trigger for my writing, and that pivot that I made to move from, you know, doing this athletic stuff to something new, when I realised that something was up with my body and I needed to pay it a little bit of respect and slow it down a bit. And I actually listened to your recent podcast with Karen Skidmore, and she talked about
the shifts.
and she talked about the trigger moment that prompted her to write a book about burnout was when her father died. And so similarly, my trigger moment was when I was 47 and mum died. Now, 47, of course, was the time I was training for that big run. And look, there was a lot to deal with at that time. I was the epitome of that sandwich generation, having, you know, 3 teenagers and all the complexities that come with that. And I was also managing my father's affairs due to his failing health, and also looking after, I've got 2 dads, my grieving stepfather who came to live with us. Layer on top of that my own grief, and also the fact that I was clueless that my body was starting to go through menopause. It was a time just so full of heightened anxiety, and I found the space I needed to deal with it through that running training. But the strangest thing was happening at that time, and that was while I was out there pounding the pavements, these fictitious characters would pop into my head. And some of them were similar to people from my upbringing, so people my mum would have known. And a plot was starting to develop for a fiction novel. And so I learnt when I was out running to dictate notes into my phone and then put them on my computer when I got home. And I just kept collecting this information, and I wasn't sure where I was going to go with it. But then, and I don't know if I shared this with you previously, Rachel, but then a year after my mum died, my sister died. And this added another whole new layer and load of grief into the mix. And it was also at that time I knew without a doubt that my body was changing, and I was physically and emotionally grinding to a halt. And so I started to find, you know, the training and competing hard, and I had to just do that run and think, right, what is it that you need to do next here? So my first hurdle was finding my new drug, because when you train and compete like that, it can be quite intoxicating, and you've really got to wean yourself down and come off it. So it took a lot of walking and self-talk to pivot, to line up in my own head. I put together 2 new endurance events. So the first one was going to be getting through menopause without being locked up for insanity or homicide, because I felt quite unhinged, and I can hear all the ladies listening to this saying, yes, I understand that, because I know we all feel the same. I know we do. And my second goal, just out of the blue, was to write a whole entire book. And I phrased that deliberately, Rachel, because according to the internet, 97% of manuscripts never get finished. So these were going to be my 2 new marathons. So I started writing this book knowing nothing about writing a book. I never studied writing. I wasn't even a prolific reader. And can you believe I even just picked up a random novel from my bookshelf and opened it up and thought, right, it's got 26 chapters. Obviously, I should write 26 chapters. And I had to look up online, and I read it had 85,000 words. Right, I write 85,000 words. And I joined a local writers' centre, and I did a couple of writing workshops. And, you know, 2 things were impressed upon me: try and have a portfolio of published works to impress a publisher one day, and write what you know. So given I was in the throes of perimenopause, and what I like to call my whores were moaning, it is not surprising my first article was called Perimenopause Buckle Up Girls. And so here I was, 52 years of age, late onset writer, and I submitted that article to a local media outlet called Her Canberra, and I've been a freelance columnist with them since. And that's the article, of course, that led me on to the menopause awareness advocacy space, because I ended up on TV and radio and magazines because, of course, breaking the taboos of menopause, I think we're a little bit behind you girls in the UK who are just rocking it. But, we're all saying, what the heck? Why didn't we know about this? Why weren't we taught in school? Why do we go to our GPs and have them scratching their heads at us? Why do I know more than my GP about this part of life?
Yeah.
It's so there I was, bang, pivot. I was now a late onset writer, and I had some new goals, and it was fantastic, and I really appreciated that I was able to eke that out of that very griefful time.
Yeah, that must have been so tough. I mean, I can't begin to imagine how tough that must have been. And your stepfather and your father as well, presumably having to cope with all of that as well. Yeah. No wonder you had a difficult menopause. Honestly, when you tell me all these things, I just think, oh goodness me, how?
I mean, I love
How
that saying,
difficult.
sandwich generation. It's because it really does describe us, and it validates what women go through at this time. And 50% of the population go through it, yet we're never prepared for it. And look, I do hope that changes with the next generation. I certainly plan on making sure that I don't leave my girls wondering what's happening with their bodies. And I mean, they've seen Mum on telly talking about it now, so they're probably more versed on it than most middle-aged women at this stage, actually. But it's a tough time. But I'm one of many women that go through that.
Well, my motto is be prepared, not scared.
Yeah, I love that.
The more information we can get out into the world about what is going on. I mean, we are doing well actually in the UK now that it is going to be on the curriculum. My hope is that it will not be just negativity and HRT, because that's what slightly concerns me, because the voices that are clamouring to get it on the curriculum are the voices that see it as something dreadful, and a lot of them that every woman should take hormone replacement therapy. And I know there are lots of other alternatives to that, and I know that actually in the same I don't know if you've heard me say this, but I think in terms of the issues that come up in menopause, there's like the canary in the coal mine. They're actually the body saying, hey, I can't do this anymore. You need to adapt, you need to change. And if you don't listen, I'm going to give you worse menopause symptoms until you listen. Yeah, so I see menopause as really something quite positive. I know it can be very difficult for a lot of women, but overall I see it as positive. And in fact, if we look at the way it has transformed your life already, that's a very powerful thing. And so I want it to be balanced. I want any discussion to be balanced, so. But we are going to be getting it on the curriculum. Maybe even it already is, I don't know. But yeah, it's good. It'd be great if we could do that in other parts of the world, so that sex education doesn't end with childbirth, because there's a bit more to come.
Yeah. And I think, wanting to speak up and be in this place is probably a part of what has now become my most recent late onset project. And that is that I call myself a late onset feminist now. And this is a part of pushing this agenda around menopause. And that evocative moniker that I've embraced, this idea of being a late onset feminist, actually came from a podcast called Women with Clout. And they interviewed a lady called Dr. Kirsten Ferguson, who's a respected consultant in the leadership space here in Australia. And she talked about her career. She'd been in the Air Force, the Royal Australian Air Force. She was a cadet officer. And she became the dux of her academy in her 4th year. Yet she was offered the second top cadet job for the following year because her superior officers said they weren't ready for a woman in the top role. And in this podcast, of course, this all happened back in the 90s.
I'm pulling a face here. You
I know. So this happened to her back in the 90s. And she was asked, how did she feel about it at the time? And she said, well, she actually felt grateful. And she realised now how bizarre that thinking was, and referred to herself as a late onset feminist, which is evident by the fact that today she coaches businesses and sits on boards pushing for equity in representation and salary for women. But I had that profound moment of realisation that I guess I too had tried to fly under the radar of feminism myself for a good part of my life, but now I actually feel quite differently. And So through my writing, which, when writing my book, I was having a great time, didn't know how to write a book, but that doesn't matter. I started, writing these articles, and initially they were quirky opinion pieces, but then they became sort of almost political in some of them. And I wrote a article last year called "We Need to Talk About Harvey Weinstein." Now, there's a stinky, vile name that I think most women would have heard of. And of course, he was the Hollywood producer, and had been 3 years before allegations of sexual abuse against him had surfaced and the whole Me Too movement was born. Now, two things sparked me to write it. Firstly, he'd popped back in the news again because he'd had another 6 charges laid against him, even though he was already in jail. And secondly, I felt I had to fess up to my shameful admission that when I first heard of Harvey Weinstein and his sex crimes, I thought casting couch. And to be very clear, Rachel, that is not what I think now, but it sort of consumed me initially, wondering how these women didn't escape these situations with Weinstein, because in the 80s I had to navigate the minefield of being a young woman in a world run by men and work around their sexist behaviours. And then, of course, came my absolute epiphany, and that was, I was the unwitting accessory to generations of men who used their power, and I was just lucky that I didn't get a Weinstein in my path. And so in playing along all those years, with their comments and laughing at their innuendo, rather than calling them out, I felt like I'd been an accomplice, and I just wanted to set that right. And there's actually even a term for this that I learnt recently. It's called internalized misogyny, and this is women minimising the value of other women and themselves to perpetuate that gender bias. And although I don't believe it was a conscious choice of mine, it comes from, how and when I was raised and had to navigate my own life. It's certainly a regrettable one, and one I decided I was going to flip the switch on. And I think back to my formative years in the late 70s. Do you remember that time, Rachel? Where,
I do.
pop icons were, the character Sandy in the movie Grease, who felt she had to, give up her bobby socks and wear leather pants and makeup and, smoke a cigarette to get the boy. It was what we were brought up with was a far cry from the suffragettes. Yeah. And I also recall in the 80s, I had an interview for a promotion in my boss's hotel room. Can you believe it? I mean, fortunately, it didn't go the way one could imagine, but I certainly wouldn't accept that today.
I once had that.
Oh.
I was on a business
How did it go?
I was well, it wasn't an interview, but I was on a business trip, and it was just me and my boss. And at once, he asked me to come to his room, and I was like, what's going on? Why? And I think what he was doing was enabling me to make a move should I want to, but why on earth I would have wanted to. He was a good 20 years older than me, and he was I was very young, well, not that young, I was sort of late 20s, but I was just thinking, as you were talking about the casting couch, think of the way the world initially responded to Monica Lewinsky.
Oh, yes.
It was her. She was the predator, wasn't she? And now we look at that so differently. So differently. But how long overdue is that? And how much... Apparently I read that Katie Couric, who, I really love Katie Couric, but even she, referred to Monica Lewinsky in very unsavoury terms, rather than, casting aspersions on Clinton.
I absolutely love this new generation and that challenging me on things that just fall out of my mouth, out of habit, out of the way things were. And, I've written a number of articles now where I've actually outed myself as having had these, internalized misogynistic moments, but I've really chosen a side, and that is feminism, even though I didn't think I qualified. But now I think, no, I'm choosing a side. Look, I hope that through my writing I empower other women, that it's perfectly okay to admit that the way we operated back then was not the gold standard, girls. You can't sit back now and say that was a good thing that happened then. And I don't want to be that older person who doubles down on bad practices of the past because they can't be bothered to speak up, or they feel the need to save face on the beliefs that they held in their younger years. So, that podcast I heard, and Kirsten Ferguson and her admission that she was grateful for getting the second top job and being told that, at least, it wasn't a girl that was beating her to the top job, it was a boy, And yet today, as a middle-aged woman, she's a champion for women. So I thought, I can do that too. I can be that person. And it's a great, great person to be.
That's very exciting. I mean, there is so much to be done, isn't there? Because we are still competing for 1 or 2 seats at the top table. We are not competing for all the seats at the top table. And that's what we should be doing. The men have been doing that for centuries, millennia.
Yeah. Well, that's right. Well, when you look at menopause alone, in my menopause advocacy, I really scratched my head. I'm an intelligent woman. I was very aware of my body. Why didn't I know about menopause? And I thought, there's got to be a history to this. And I started to just do a bit of a research. And firstly, menopause wasn't even a word early last century. It was called deficiency disorder that women got when they got a bit older and crabby. And when you look back 200 years ago, well, our average life expectancy was around 40. So we fell off the perch before we got old enough to be in menopause.
Well, I don't agree with you on that, actually.
No?
I've done my research.
Oh, okay. Enlighten me.
I'm about to publish a book.
Oh,
and
good.
it's included in that. But menopause is mentioned in ancient Chinese writings, ancient Greek writings, and also if you look at obviously in certain parts of the world, we didn't live past menopause. But for example, England, Wales, many women were living past menopause in the 16th century. So I think it depends on where, and in industrialized nations, etc., but there were a lot of us that were living a long past, because the main issue was whether or not we survived childbirth and childhood, so that the overall figures are skewed because you need to look at the women who survived childhood.
Yeah.
Those actually went on and lived quite a long life.
Well, then all those women who got to the Victorian era of being that age, they got locked up though with hysteria, didn't they? Is that a part of your book?
Not all of them. No. There was an awful lot of negativity. You're absolutely right about that. But we did go through menopause. And also, I mean, my thinking is that I think it's really interesting because if we look at other cultures don't appear to suffer as much as we do now. So I actually have a theory that we suffer more now because of the lives that we live now, because we put ourselves under so much stress, because there are so many toxins in our environment and in our personal products. Those ingredients can impact our hormones. The way that we eat much more sugar now than our ancestors ever ate, and the sugar that we consume has an impact on our blood sugar levels, which puts stress on the body, which then impacts the hormones. So I think we have, because of the way we live now, we've actually made our menopause worse now than it was in the past. And that, yes, we did survive. Some of us did. Not all of us, but some of us did.
Well, where do I sign up for this book? Because, obviously information I find, I glean off the internet. I'm not finding this out from anyone who's of any authority because, basically most people don't care about it.
I wouldn't claim to have authority. And as I say in the disclaimer to my book, I am not a doctor. But I have heard a lot of these facts, out in the world, and I've thought, that just doesn't sound right to me. So I've gone digging. Digging. So there's quite a lot of research in my book, about that, and trying to sort of put things right.
Would you agree then that society it is a rite of passage to go through puberty and a rite of passage to give birth, but you bugger off when you get old and you're going through menopause? Do you see that?
Absolutely. And I'm here to change that, like you are. Like, no frigging way, thank you very much. I want us to celebrate menopause. I
Yeah, oh,
really do. I want us
absolutely.
to understand it, be able to manage it, and then celebrate it for what it is, because I really do see it as a gift. It was for me. It came really early for me at 41, and it killed my dreams of having another child. But on balance, it has given me just as much as it maybe took away, if not more.
When I think of all the museums I've been to in the world, there's, depictions of fertility and pregnancy and birth and, you know, sex, but you don't see many things of old women, going through menopause with a few chin hairs. So it's it's certainly, I don't think it's had the respect it's needed, certainly from any society my forefathers have been a part of. And as far as your early onset menopause, well, that's another late onset for me, Rachel.
You're still going, aren't you?
I'm 54. I'm 54 years old and I'm still perimenopausal. I'm hoping next March.
But that is actually a sign of health. So don't knock it. To still be menstruating at your age is still a sign of your health. Your body's doing what it's supposed to do. Mine conked out because I'd put it under too much stress, different kinds of stress. I wasn't running Ironmans and things like that, But I lived a very stressful life, and I'd had a lot of stresses in my life, and I didn't manage my stress well. Now I've learnt better how to manage my stress, so that, I'm a very different person now to who I was then.
And that's managing stress is so important. Those cortisol levels, just what it does to your heart, let alone, how it might play with your hormones as well. And so, yeah, it's interesting times.
So why do you think that women so often settle for the way things are? Because I know you're passionate about getting it across to women and people in general, but women especially, that there's no need to really settle.
Yeah, look, it's an interesting one. Look, I heard Juju Hook, who you interviewed on one of your episodes too, Rachel. I've been listening in.
She's great. You have. I like it when my guests have listened to the podcast.
Well, I love it when I just, I hear something that just resonates with me. And she said, we've become to believe our feelings are facts. And I think this is what's happening to women. There's a lot going on midlife and a lot of chatter in our heads with a cast of inner critics ready to take a shot and tell us that it's, too late to embrace something new or change your mind, And like Juju, I learnt a long time ago that I'm not my thoughts, and that I can let them in and I can listen to them and I can tell them to bugger off too if I don't think they're right. And so although menopause or perimenopause that I'm going through for another 50, 100 million years, it throws us some pretty...
It's good.
Yeah, I'm loving it. I just love it. Buckle up. Throws us, some pretty momentous hormonal challenges, no doubt. You also need to sort of tap in and capitalise on some of the wonderful things that happen to women at this time. And you need to realise that we're wriggling out of a chrysalis of midlife change, and there's some real positives. So for me, I no longer feel I need to be a crowd pleaser, because I just don't care how I look doing the things I want to do, and that's liberating. And I also put myself first much more often than I once did, the old oxygen mask on first. And it's true. You do that, and it's from that base that I'm actually in a better position to help others. So, it's a win-win when you do that. And with all this, backed with a lifetime of wisdom, I feel really powerful, and I just refuse to give in to my thoughts and the things that my body's tricking me into thinking that, I shouldn't do. And as I said earlier, it's that shifting my motivation, my point of motivation, and that is I don't fear failure. I couldn't give a fat rat's if I don't publish my book, Don't even know how to write a book, so I can't imagine someone's going to publish it. They might. I'm going through with an editor at the moment, so. But
it's always self-publishing. That's what I'm doing.
Oh, look, that's right. I can do anything.
It's so much faster.
when I first started to do exercise, I'd start and stop and start and stop and start and stop. And the thing that eventually got me out the door was one day my husband would, because he had to go to work, I would try and go for a run really early in the morning. And I would turn the alarm on every morning, switch over, reach with my hand, turn it off and go back to sleep. And then one day I said, right, you are never going to run again. I'm never going to allow you to run again if you don't get up tomorrow morning. So that's it. Stop being an idiot. You know, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. Madness. So I went to bed with my running clothes on. And then I got my alarm clock and I put it on the floor and pushed it over towards the window so that it was out of my reach.
Had to get up.
So the only way I could turn it off. And by the time I was on my feet and I was fully clothed to go running, all I had to do was put my shoes on, and I did. And that developed my regret intolerance, because I have learned that when I decide I'm going to try something, I've really got to do it. Otherwise, some of those voices in my head are good ones and tell me, for heaven's sakes, Jo, come on, at least give it a go. And you've got to try and tap into that. You've got to find that. And all those other things you talked about too, Rachel, you know, I like to have a glass of wine, but I know that it affects my sleep. And I know at the moment sleep is problematic at the best of times anyway. So I just know, don't drink, you know, and that doesn't mean never have a drink, but at the moment I just don't drink alcohol. And I can tell you, I know for a fact it's affecting my sleep, because I started wearing my watch to bed and it records my sleep. My heart rate overnight is 5 beats per minute on average higher if I've had a glass of wine with dinner. And I'm not talking half a bottle here, I'm talking a glass of wine with dinner. So, you know, get yourself a smartwatch, whack it on your wrist, and if you don't believe me, try that out. You know, I really encourage women to seek out all these life hacks and fantastic, you know, things that we have now, and have a look for yourself, because I think I'm worried that women are seeking out options to mask or add a layer on to things that maybe a few tweaks could. And it doesn't have to be forever, but there's one thing I do know is we need sleep.
Sleep is so important. There's a big section on sleep in my book.
Oh, I can't wait for your book.
In fact, I write about it twice, because I write about it in the menopause context and then I write about it in the and beyond context, because there's a big section on and beyond. It is so important, so important. And for brain health especially, you know, for guarding against dementia, we need to get good sleep. Yeah. But it's fascinating, isn't it? Because so many of us, we're in denial. We want the booze because it switches us off, but actually it doesn't really help us, especially, as you say, while the hormones are messing about. And perhaps we can come back to it later, but you're right, it doesn't, in perimenopause, it doesn't help. No.
And, you know, I mean, I just learned I have to go to bed and be asleep for, well, you know, from the time I close my eyes to the time I decide, you know, I'm going to get out of bed, I have to be in there for 8.5 hours. I can't do 7 hours anymore. I can't do 7.5 hours, because within that 8.5 hours, I might have got out of bed 3 times or thrown the covers off. And so the amount of quality sleep I'm getting in 8.5 hours is obviously not 8.5 hours. And so, yep, I'm back to being like a primary school age child, having to get to bed early to be able to get up in the morning. But that's okay. I can do that. You know, I respect my body's got to do this. And just, so, you know, when women say they're dreadfully tired, but they're still going to bed at 11 and they're getting up at 6, you know, have a think about that.
It's not surprising, is it?
No.
Yeah.
And so that's certainly, I'm still doing that. And come on next March.
So what do you most want midlife women to know?
Oh, look, I want midlife women to know that it really is better late than never, and shake off all those that self-consciousness of your youth. You know, if you haven't cottoned on already, we're older and we just don't give a hoot. And embrace that and use that to allow yourself to do something different. And start with this. Okay, so I encourage you all to start with this. So the other day, we're in lockdown here at the moment with COVID. So we're, you know, through another round of it. We're just starting to get our immunisation levels right in this country, but we are in lockdown, and we're, I think, 7 weeks into it here in the ACT. And I met up with a friend, because you're allowed to go walking with one friend. And I told her how miserable I was feeling, because after about 5 weeks, I just felt miserable. And I thought, that's okay, I'm allowed to feel miserable. I'll tell my friend about it. And she said, right, you're to go away this week and go and do something new, because she'd been knitting little beanies, hats, and she had never done that before. So she sent me off for a week and said I had to do something new. So I went away, and I went home, and what did I do? I'm on Facebook, drooling over my cup of tea and, being miserable. And I came across this video someone had shared, and it was the song Footloose from the movie, Kenny Loggins, and they had put together all these fantastic old clips of dancing from all these old movies to the song. And I thought, I'm going to learn the steps to Footloose. So I went online and on YouTube, and I found a tutorial to the steps of Footloose, and a week later I learnt the song and danced it to her in a car park where we'd parked our cars to go walking. And so the reason why I'm telling you this is because you might think that, okay, well, that's okay for you, you're a fit person. Oh my Lord, I cannot dance. And I think about, when was the last time I would have danced to that song? It was probably like 30 years ago. And I would have been tanked at a nightclub, and I would have been young and carefree. And hey, I could move. I think I looked okay, and everyone else was drinking too. So they thought I looked okay. But apparently at the age of 54, I can't move. And so my brain just went into overdrive, trying to move to the beat, trying to remember the movements. And I realised, here's another thing that I'm starting to lose because I don't use it, because I haven't gone dancing for a long time. Anyway, now I'm brilliant, and if Footloose 2 comes out, I'm sure Kevin Bacon will give me a call, but the point being is that it was something that I gave a go, and I found it really difficult. It took me the whole entire week to get like a few boot scoot moves and a couple of kicking of my legs right. And it was challenging, and I'm really glad I challenged it, because for another day, I've staved off osteoporosis by hitting the ground hard, and I've staved off dementia by making my brain try and move to music and remember those things. And it was a lot of fun, and I gave my friend a lot of amusement. So all I have to do is say, it doesn't have to be something physical. It can be, something more cerebral. It can be a craft thing. It can be, wanting to write. It can be, wanting to get involved in theatre, wanting to sing. You got to sing. Singing's good. Don't allow yourself to think you're too old, because you're just not. You're definitely not.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Magnificent Midlife podcast. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, follow, and share it. Also, giving a 5-star review really helps get the word out. You'll find the show notes at magnificentmidlife.com. That's also where you can get my book, Magnificent Midlife, Transform Your Middle Years, Menopause, and Beyond. Make the very best of your next chapter. Help me change the world, one magnificent midlife woman at a time.